Sometimes the deepest loneliness lives in the quietest hearts. You know that feeling when you come home to an empty house and wonder if anyone would notice if you just disappeared one day. In the small town of Willow Gap, Miss Eliza Hart teaches school and goes home alone each night. Her fiancé never returned from the war, leaving her with nothing but memories and a boarding room that feels more like a tomb than a home. Across town, Thatcher Cole built a ranch with his own hands, but he built it for a family he's never had. His cabin echoes with silence, and folks in town whisper about the gentle giant who seems too afraid to let anyone close. When a storm destroys Eliza's roof, she finds herself at Thatcher's door with nowhere else to go. What he offers changes everything between them. But can two people who've forgotten how to hope learn to love again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Gap's dusty main street, where wooden storefronts stood like weathered sentinels against another day's relentless heat. This was a town that had seen better times and worse ones, where folks knew each other's business, but respected the silences that came with frontier living. The kind of place where a person could disappear into routine and find both comfort and sorrow in the predictability of each passing day. Miss Eliza Hart stepped carefully along the uneven boardwalk, her worn leather satchel containing the day's lessons pressed close to her side. At 28, she carried herself with the practiced grace of a woman who had learned to make dignity her closest companion. Her dark hair was pinned in a simple chignon, practical rather than fashionable, and her blue cotton dress had been mended twice at the sleeves where chalk dust and childhood enthusiasm had taken their toll. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town like a beacon of hope, its white clapboard sides reflecting the morning light. Eliza had arrived in Willow Gap 3 years ago, carrying little more than her teaching credentials and a heart that had been shattered by news that would never stop echoing in her memory. Samuel Winters, her intended, had fallen at Gettysburg. The telegram had been brief, brutal in its efficiency. Regret to inform you, Private Samuel Winters killed in action. July 20 stop remains will not be recovered. Stop. Deepest sympathies. Stop. She pushed open the schoolhouse door and breathed in the familiar scent of chalk dust and pine boards. This place had become her sanctuary, where the eager faces of children aged 6 to 14 reminded her daily that hope could still take root in the hardest ground. Her teaching primer, a leather-bound volume that had belonged to her own teacher back in Pennsylvania, lay open on her desk where she'd left it the evening before. Its pages were soft with handling, margins filled with her careful notes about each student's needs and progress. "Good morning, Miss Hart," called out young Jimmy Brennan as he burst through the door, his freckled face bright with excitement. "Ma says there's a storm coming tonight. Big one." Eliza smiled, the expression transforming her serious features into something warm and maternal. "Good morning, Jimmy. Let's hope your mother is wrong about that storm. Now, take your seat and help me set out the slates." As the children filed in, Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with the morning ritual. She loved these moments, when the schoolhouse filled with chatter and laughter, when the loneliness that followed her like a shadow seemed to retreat to the corners. Here, she was needed. Here, she mattered. The day passed in the comfortable rhythm of lessons and recitations, geography lessons about distant states, arithmetic problems scratched on slate boards, reading from McGuffey's primer. Eliza moved between the students with practiced ease, adjusting a hand position here, offering encouragement there, always mindful that for some of these children, school might be the only place they encountered gentleness. As the afternoon wore on, she noticed the sky darkening through the schoolhouse windows. Jimmy's mother might have been right about that storm after all. The wind began to pick up, rattling the glass panes and sending dust devils spinning across the schoolyard. "Children, let's dismiss a bit early today," she announced, watching the concern creep across young faces. "Gather your things quickly and head straight home. No dawdling." The exodus was swift but orderly, each child offering a polite goodbye before hurrying into the mounting wind. Eliza watched from the doorway as they scattered toward their homes, small figures bent against the gusts, and felt the old familiar pang of watching others return to families while she returned to solitude. She locked the schoolhouse and began her own walk home, clutching her shawl against the wind. Her boarding room at Mrs. Patterson's house was a modest affair, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small table where she prepared her lessons by lamplight. But it was hers, paid for with her teacher's salary, and she had made it as comfortable as circumstances allowed. A few books lined a makeshift shelf, and pressed flowers from her students decorated the single window. Mrs. Patterson met her at the front door, wringing her hands. "Oh, Miss Hart, I'm so worried about this storm. The roof's been making terrible sounds all day. I keep thinking we should all gather in the cellar, but then I remember the last time we did that, and the dampness nearly killed poor Mr. Patterson's lungs." Eliza touched the older woman's arm gently. "I'm sure we'll be fine, Mrs. Patterson. These old houses have weathered many storms." But as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming on more than just the wind. Meanwhile, 3 miles outside town, Thatcher Cole stood on the covered porch of his cabin, watching the storm clouds gather like dark cavalry on the horizon. At 35, he was a man built for this harsh country, 6 feet and 4 inches of muscle and bone, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or split fence posts with equal ease. His dark hair was touched with premature silver at the temples, and his green eyes held the kind of steady calm that came from learning early that the world could take everything from you without warning. The cabin behind him was solid, built to last, with thick log walls and a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly even in the worst weather. He had built it with his own hands 7 years ago, after purchasing the land with money saved from years of working other men's cattle. Every board, every stone, every nail had been placed with the vision of a family that would someday fill these rooms with laughter and love. But the rooms remained empty except for the sound of his own footsteps. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had built a home for a family while living the life of a hermit. The townspeople knew him as a fair man, honest in his dealings, quick to help a neighbor in need. But they also sensed something untouchable about Thatcher Cole, a quality that kept social invitations polite but infrequent, and conversations respectful but brief. He couldn't blame them. After losing his parents and younger sister in a house fire when he was barely 20, he had learned that loving someone meant risking a pain so deep it could hollow out a man's chest and leave him gasping for years afterward. Better to keep to himself, to pour his need for nurturing into the land and the cattle, to find companionship in the reliable rhythm of ranch work. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Thatcher's horses whinnied nervously in the paddock. He would need to get them into the barn soon, along with the cattle in the near pasture. This storm was shaping up to be a fierce one, the kind that could tear roofs off and flood dry creek beds in a matter of hours. As he moved toward the barn, his thoughts turned briefly to the schoolteacher in town. He had seen Miss Hart at church services and community gatherings, had noticed the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, the way children flocked to her like she was some kind of gentle magnet. There was something about her that spoke to the lonely places in his heart, but he had never presumed to approach her beyond polite nods and brief pleasantries. A woman like that, educated and refined, would have no use for a rough rancher who spent more time talking to cattle than people. Besides, he had heard the whispers about her lost love, the fiancé who had died in the war, and he respected the privacy of grief. He understood what it meant to carry sorrow like a stone in your chest. The wind picked up suddenly, sending his hat tumbling across the yard. As he chased after it, the first fat raindrops began to fall, and Thatcher hurried to secure his animals for the storm. He had no way of knowing that in town similar preparations were taking place, and that before this night was over, 2 solitary lives would intersect in a way that would change everything. The storm hit Willow Gap just after 8 o'clock, arriving with the fury of something that had traveled 1,000 miles just to tear apart this particular patch of earth. Rain came in sheets, driven by winds that howled like banshees around the corners of buildings and through the gaps in shutters. Lightning split the darkness with violent beauty, and thunder crashed so close it seemed to shake the very ground. In her small room, Eliza sat at her table trying to grade papers by lamplight, but the storm made concentration impossible. The boarding house creaked and groaned around her, and she found herself thinking about her students, hoping they were all safe in their homes, tucked warmly into beds with parents who would chase away any fears the storm might bring. She had just set down her pen when the world seemed to explode above her head. A tremendous crack, followed by the sound of splintering wood and rushing water, and then the ceiling of her room collapsed in a cascade of rain-soaked timber and plaster. Eliza threw herself against the far wall, covering her head with her arms as debris rained down around her. When the chaos settled, she found herself soaked to the skin, her few possessions scattered and ruined, and a gaping hole above her head that let in the full fury of the storm. Mrs. Patterson's voice came from somewhere below, high with panic. "Miss Hart! Miss Hart! Are you alive up there?" "I'm alive!" Eliza called back, though she wasn't entirely sure how. She gathered what she could of her belongings, the teaching primer, miraculously unharmed, a few pieces of clothing that weren't completely soaked, and made her way carefully down the treacherous stairs. Mrs. Patterson met her in the hallway, her nightgown plastered to her thin frame, her grey hair wild with worry. "Oh, my dear girl, I'm so sorry. The roof beam just gave way. I've been worried about it for months, but we never had the money to fix it properly." Mr. Patterson appeared behind his wife, shaking his head grimly. "Can't fix it tonight, that's certain. Probably take weeks to get the materials and the labor. Miss Hart, I'm afraid your room is uninhabitable." Eliza nodded, trying to process the reality of her situation. She was homeless, in the middle of a raging storm, with nowhere to go, and very little money to secure alternative lodging. The other boarding houses in town were already full, and she knew the Pattersons' budget was stretched too thin to put her up indefinitely. "Don't you worry, dear Mrs. Patterson said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "We'll figure something out. Perhaps Mrs. Hendricks has space, or maybe the Reverend and his wife." But even as the older woman spoke, Eliza knew the options were limited. Mrs. Hendricks' boarding house had been full for months, and the Reverend's house was already crowded with his own large family. In a town like Willow Gap, spare beds were as scarce as rain in summer. As she stood there dripping in the hallway, listening to the storm rage outside, Eliza felt the familiar weight of being utterly alone in the world. She had learned to be self-sufficient, to depend on no one, but sometimes circumstances stripped away all pretenses of independence and left a person face to face with their fundamental vulnerability. It was then, in that moment of desperation, that she thought of the cabin on the edge of town, and the man who lived there in solitude that might match her own. The walk to Thatcher Cole's ranch took every ounce of courage Eliza possessed. Rain lashed at her face like cold needles, and the wind threatened to tear her sodden shawl from her shoulders with each step. She clutched her teaching primer against her chest, the leather binding slick with rain but somehow still intact, and forced herself to place one muddy boot in front of the other. What was she doing? The thought hammered at her consciousness with each flash of lightning. A respectable, unmarried woman didn't arrive at a bachelor's door in the middle of the night, soaked to the skin and desperate for shelter. The scandal alone could cost her the teaching position she'd worked so hard to maintain. But what choice did she have? Sleep in the barn behind the general store, huddle in the church vestibule until morning? The outline of Thatcher's cabin emerged from the darkness like something from a fever dream, golden lamplight spilling from its windows in warm rectangles that promised safety from the storm's fury. Eliza paused at the edge of his property, suddenly paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, stern warnings about propriety and reputation, about how quickly a woman's good name could be destroyed by a single moment of poor judgment. But then another gust of wind nearly knocked her from her feet, and survival instinct overrode social convention. She stumbled up the porch steps and raised her hand to knock on the heavy wooden door. Before her knuckles could make contact, the door swung open. Thatcher Cole stood silhouetted against the warm interior light, his imposing frame filling the doorway. He was dressed in work clothes, wool pants, and a cotton shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbow sand. His dark hair was mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it. When he saw her, his green eyes widened with surprise and immediate concern. "Miss Hart?" His voice was deep, measured, with the slight roughness that came from years of calling to cattle across open ranges. "What in God's name are you doing out in this storm?" Eliza opened her mouth to speak, but found that words had abandoned her. She stood there dripping on his porch, clutching her primer like a lifeline, and felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. The events of the evening, the roof collapse, the destruction of her meager possessions, the stark reality of her homeless state suddenly overwhelmed her, and she began to shake. Without hesitation, Thatcher stepped forward and gently took her arm. Come in before you catch your death." He guided her through the doorway and immediately began closing shutters against the storm. "You're soaked clean through. What happened?" "The roof," Eliza managed through chattering teeth, "at Mrs. Patterson's. It collapsed. I have nowhere." She stopped, unable to finish the admission of her complete vulnerability. Thatcher was already moving, pulling a handmade quilt from the back of a chair near the fireplace. The quilt was beautiful, intricate in its design, with deep blues and greens that reminded Eliza of a forest pool. The stitching was precise, clearly the work of skilled hands, and she found herself wondering where he had acquired such a treasure. "Here," he said, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. The fabric was soft and warm, smelling faintly of cedar, and something else she couldn't identify, something clean and masculine and comforting. "Sit by the fire while I get you something dry to wear." "I can't," Eliza began, but Thatcher held up a hand. "Miss Hart, you're shivering so hard you can barely speak. Propriety can wait until you're not in danger of freezing to death in my parlor." He disappeared into what she assumed was his bedroom, leaving Eliza alone to take in her surroundings. The cabin's interior was not what she had expected. Instead of the sparse, utilitarian space she had imagined, she found herself in a room that spoke of careful attention to comfort and beauty. Hand-hewn furniture gleamed with careful maintenance, and bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that suggested a mind hungry for knowledge. A chess set sat on a side table, the pieces carved from what looked like local wood and polished to a warm sheen. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a small collection of objects caught her attention: a photograph of what must have been his family, a pocket watch, and a few other personal items arranged with the kind of care that spoke of their deep significance. This was not the home of a rough, unlettered cowboy, but of a man who valued beauty and learning and the small graces that made a house into a home. Thatcher returned with an armload of clothing, a wool shirt that would dwarf her slender frame, thick socks, and what appeared to be a pair of trousers with suspenders. "These belong to my father," he said simply. "They'll be too large, but they're dry and warm. You can change in the bedroom." Eliza took the clothes with hands that were finally beginning to steady. "Mr. Cole, I don't know how to thank you. I know this is highly irregular." "Nothing irregular about helping a neighbor in distress," he interrupted gently. "Go on now, get out of those wet things before you take ill." The bedroom was as carefully tended as the main room, with a large bed covered in quilts and pillows that looked hand-sewn. Eliza changed quickly, grateful for the warmth of dry clothing, even if the garments hung on her like scarecrow clothes. When she emerged, she found Thatcher tending the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. He had prepared tea in a china service that seemed incongruous with his rough exterior, and had set out a plate of bread and preserves on the small table by the fire. When he turned to look at her, something shifted in his expression, softening around the eyes, that made her suddenly aware of how she must look. Swimming in his father's oversized clothes, with her dark hair hanging in damp waves around her shoulders. "Better?" he asked, and she nodded, taking the chair he gestured toward. "Much better, thank you." She accepted the cup of tea he offered, wrapping her hands around it for warmth. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this. I didn't know where else to go." Thatcher settled into the chair across from her, his own cup dwarfed by his large hands. No imposition. I was just sitting here listening to the storm and thinking how empty this place feels sometimes. The admission seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't meant to voice it aloud. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the continued fury of the storm outside. Eliza found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the strong jaw and the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, as if he smiled more often than his serious demeanor suggested. "This quilt," she said finally, touching the fabric that still draped her shoulders. "It's beautiful. The workmanship is extraordinary." A flush of color crept up Thatcher's neck. "Made it myself, actually. During the long winter evenings. Gives a man something to do with his hands besides worry." Eliza stared at him in amazement. "You made this, but the stitching, the pattern, it's so intricate." "My mother taught me before she died, said a man should know how to mend and make, same as a woman. Practical skill." He shrugged, but she could see the pride in his work beneath his modest words. The revelation shifted something in Eliza's perception of this man. The careful home, the beautiful quilt, the gentle way he had welcomed her in from the storm, these were not the actions of a rough frontiersman, but of someone who understood the value of tenderness, who had learned to create beauty, even in solitude. "Mr. Cole," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was thinking. "Thatcher," he said quietly, "given the circumstances, I think we can dispense with formalities." Thatcher. His name felt strange on her lips, intimate in a way that made her pulse quicken. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know, I understand how presumptuous it is." He waited, his green eyes steady on her face. "I have nowhere to go," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Mrs. Patterson's roof will take weeks to repair, if she can afford to repair it at all. The other boarding houses are full, and I can't afford to travel to another town to look for lodging. I know it's scandalous and improper, but would you consider allowing me to stay here, just temporarily, until I can make other arrangements?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's continued assault on the cabin. Eliza held her breath, waiting for the polite refusal that would leave her with no options but to impose on the charity of families who could barely afford to feed themselves. Instead, Thatcher leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked directly into her eyes. "Miss Hart Eliza, I want you to listen to me carefully." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she nodded. "You have empty pockets," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I have an empty bed." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She started to rise from her chair, her mind reeling with shock and disappointment. Had she so badly misjudged his character? Was this the price he expected for his shelter? But Thatcher was already reaching out, his hand gentle on her arm. "Wait, please." That came out wrong. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady and sincere. "What I meant was, you need a home, and I have one that's too big for just me. You need safety and shelter, and I can provide that. Not no the way it sounded. I mean a place where you won't be alone anymore, where you'll be safe and cared for. Nothing more than you're comfortable with. Nothing that would compromise your honor or mine." Eliza sank back into the chair, her heart still racing. "I don't understand." Thatcher ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling for the right words. "I built this place for a family I never had. 7 years I've been rattling around in here by myself, and it gets lonesome. You need a place to stay, and I need the sound of another voice in these rooms. Company, conversation. Maybe we could help each other. What would people say? People will talk regardless. They always do. But anyone who knows either of us would know we're honorable. And if it bothers you, I can sleep in the barn." Eliza looked around the warm, comfortable room, then back at this man who had opened his door to her without question, who had wrapped her in his own quilt and offered her shelter from more than just the storm. The practical part of her mind catalogued the risks, the damage to her reputation, the potential loss of her teaching position, the impropriety of the entire arrangement. But the lonely part of her heart, the part that had been aching in silence for 3 years, whispered that maybe, just maybe, This was exactly where she was meant to be. "All right," she said softly. "If you're sure it won't be too much trouble." Thatcher's face broke into the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, transforming his stern features into something warm and surprisingly boyish. "No trouble at all, Eliza. No trouble at all." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, two lonely souls had found something neither had dared to hope, for a place where empty hearts might learn to be full again. Eliza woke to the unfamiliar sound of birdsong and the gentle creak of settling timber. For a moment, she lay still in Thatcher's large bed, disoriented by the morning light streaming through windows that faced east instead of north, by the absence of Mrs. Patterson's voice calling to her husband about breakfast preparations. Then memory flooded back the storm, the collapsed roof, the desperate walk through the rain, and Thatcher's unexpected kindness. She had insisted on taking the small settee in the main room, but Thatcher would have none of it, disappearing into the barn with blankets and a pillow before she could protest further. The gesture had been both gentlemanly and practical, but it left her feeling the weight of obligation in ways she wasn't prepared for. Now, wrapped in his father's oversized clothes and surrounded by the scent of cedar and leather that seemed to permeate everything in the cabin, she felt the full awkwardness of her situation. What was the proper etiquette for morning interactions when you had imposed upon a bachelor's hospitality? How did one maintain dignity while wearing trousers held up by suspenders? A soft knock at the bedroom door interrupted her worries. "Eliza, I've made coffee and biscuits. No rush though, sleep as long as you need." His voice carried the same gentle consideration he had shown the night before, and she found herself responding before she had fully considered her words. "I'm awake. I'll be out in a moment." She rose and attempted to make herself presentable, braiding her long hair into a simple plait and rolling up the sleeves of his father's shirt until her hands were free. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Thatcher standing at the stove, his back to her as he tended a pan of eggs. He had clearly been up for some time, his hair was damp from washing, and he wore clean clothes that suggested he had prepared for her presence in his home. "Good morning," she said softly, and he turned with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "Morning. I hope you slept well. I was worried the settee might not be comfortable enough. The bed was wonderful, but you shouldn't have given up your own room. I could have managed perfectly well on the settee." Thatcher shook his head as he plated eggs alongside fresh biscuits. "My mother would haunt me if I made a lady sleep on furniture when there was a proper bed available. Besides, I slept fine in the barn. Wouldn't be the first time." He set a plate before her at the small table, and Eliza was struck again by the careful domesticity of his movements. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the biscuits golden and light, and he had even found a small jar of what looked like homemade preserves to accompany the meal. "You didn't have to go to such trouble," she protested, but he waved away her concern. "No trouble. I always cook too much anyway, habit from ranch work, when you never know how many hands might show up needing a meal." They ate in relative silence, the morning light growing stronger through the windows and revealing details of the cabin that darkness had hidden the night before. Eliza found her attention drawn to the bookshelf again, noting titles that surprised her: Shakespeare, Dickens, even a volume of poetry that looked well worn with handling. "You have quite a library," she observed, and Thatcher followed her gaze. "Books are about the only luxury I allow myself. When the work's done and the evenings get long, there's nothing better than a good story." He paused, then added with slight embarrassment, "I know it's not what folks expect from a rancher." "Why shouldn't a rancher read poetry?" Eliza asked, genuinely curious. "Intelligence isn't the province of any particular profession." Something in her tone seemed to relax him. "Most folks around here seem to think a man who works with his hands can't have much use for books. You're the first person who's ever looked at my shelves without surprise." "Well, I spend my days surrounded by books. I suppose I'm more interested in what someone chooses to read than surprised that they read at all." She gestured toward a slim volume of Whitman. "That's one of my favorites." "Mine too." Thatcher's smile was softer now, more genuine. There's something about the way he writes about the land, about finding meaning in everyday work. The conversation might have continued, but a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Thatcher rose to answer it, and Eliza heard the unmistakable voice of Mrs. Henderson, the town's most dedicated purveyor of gossip. "Mr. Cole, I do hope you'll forgive the early call, but I was just checking to see if you'd weathered the storm all right. Such a terrible night, we had trees down, roofs damaged. Poor Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was hit something fierce." Eliza felt her cheeks flame as she realized her presence in Thatcher's cabin was about to become public knowledge. She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the cabin's open layout offered no refuge. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson, thank you for asking," Thatcher replied evenly. "The cabin held up well." "Oh, that's wonderful. And I don't suppose you've heard anything about poor Miss Hart. Her room was completely destroyed, and no one seems to know where she spent the night. I'm so worried about her, out in this weather with nowhere to go." There was a pause, and Eliza could picture Thatcher weighing his options. He could lie, claim ignorance of her whereabouts, but that would only delay the inevitable discovery. Or he could tell the truth and face the immediate consequences. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, Miss Hart is here. She needed shelter after the roof collapse, and I offered her a place to stay until other arrangements can be made." The silence that followed was so complete that Eliza could hear her own heartbeat. Then Mrs. Henderson's voice, pitched higher with shock and barely contained excitement. "She's here? Now? Oh, my dear Mr. Cole, surely you understand how this looks." "It looks like a neighbor helping another neighbor in distress," Thatcher said firmly. "Miss Hart was soaked through and had nowhere else to go. I offered her shelter, nothing more." "But the proprieties, Mr. Cole, an unmarried man and woman under the same roof." "I slept in the barn, Mrs. Henderson. Miss Hart had the cabin to herself." Eliza closed her eyes, knowing that this explanation, while true, would do little to quell the gossip that was already forming in Mrs. Henderson's mind. By noon, half the town would know where she had spent the night. By evening, the story would have been embellished beyond recognition. "Perhaps I should speak with Miss Hart," Mrs. Henderson suggested, with the tone of someone doing her Christian duty, to ensure she understands the delicacy of her situation. Before Thatcher could respond, Eliza stood and moved to the door. If she was going to face the town's judgment, she preferred to do it on her own terms. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," she said with as much dignity as she could muster, while wearing men's clothing 3 sizes too large. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened as she took in Eliza's appearance, the oversized shirt, the rolled-up trousers, the loose braid of hair that spoke of intimate domesticity. "Miss Hart, my dear child, what has happened to you?" "My roof collapsed in the storm, as you mentioned. Mr. Cole was kind enough to offer me shelter. I'm very grateful for his Christian charity." "Yes, but dear, surely you understand how this appears. Your reputation, your position at the school." "My reputation is built on 3 years of dedicated service to this community's children," Eliza replied evenly. "I hardly think one night of emergency shelter will change that." But even as she spoke the words, she could see the doubt in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, the calculations already being made about scandal and impropriety. In a small town, reputation was currency, and hers had just been devalued considerably. After Mrs. Henderson left, promising to check on dear Miss Hart's welfare, with several other prominent ladies, Eliza sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I've ruined everything. Your reputation, my position." "Hey," Thatcher's voice was gentle as he knelt beside her chair. "Look at me." She raised her head to find his green eyes steady and determined. "My reputation can handle whatever they want to say about me. I'm more concerned about yours. What if they dismiss me from the school? What if the school board decides I'm not fit to teach their children? Then they're fools who don't deserve someone as dedicated as you are." He paused, then added quietly, "And if that happens, you'll still have a place here for as long as you need it." The simple sincerity of his offer brought tears to her eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me? You barely know me." Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the window, where the morning sun was burning off the last of the storm clouds. Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone in the world. Maybe because kindness is sometimes all we have to offer each other. He stood and moved to the shelf where he kept his correspondence, pulling out a small wooden box that looked worn with handling. From it, he withdrew a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon letters that bore the unmistakable signs of having been read and reread countless times. "These belonged to someone I cared about once," he said, not looking at her as he spoke. "She died of fever before we could marry. I kept thinking I should put them away, forget, move on. But they're all I have left of what might have been." He held the letters for a moment longer, then carefully returned them to the box. "I'm not telling you this for pity, or to make you feel obligated to stay. I'm telling you because I understand what it means to lose someone, to have your life change in ways you didn't choose. And I understand what it means to be grateful when someone offers you a chance to start over." Eliza stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the depth of loneliness that matched her own. Here was a man who had built a home for love that never arrived, who had learned to create beauty and comfort in solitude, who understood the ache of empty rooms and silent meals. "Samuel's letters," she said softly. "I have them too. In my teaching Primurthy, only things that survived the roof collapse." Thatcher nodded, unsurprised. "Sometimes the past is all that connects us to who we used to be. And sometimes," Eliza said, surprising herself with the thought, "it keeps us from becoming who we might be." The moment stretched between them, full of understanding and possibility, and the tentative beginning of something neither had expected to find. Outside, the town was already buzzing with gossip about the schoolteacher and the rancher, but inside the cabin, two wounded hearts were discovering that healing sometimes began with the simple act of not being alone. The chess set sat between them on the small table like a battlefield of carved possibilities. 3 days had passed since the storm, and what had begun as an emergency arrangement was settling into something that felt dangerously close to domestic contentment. Eliza had attempted twice to find alternative lodging, but Mrs. Henderson's enthusiastic spread of gossip had effectively closed those doors. The other boarding house suddenly had no vacancies, and the few families who might have taken in a teacher were now concerned about the propriety of housing someone whose reputation had been compromised. "Your move," Thatcher said quietly, his green eyes focused on the board rather than her face. They had discovered the chess set on her second evening in the cabin, when she had commented on the beautiful craftsmanship of the pieces. Each figure was carved from local wood oak for one side, pine for the other, and polished to a warm glow that spoke of countless hours of patient work. Eliza studied the board, but her mind was only half on strategy. The other half was consumed with awareness of the man across from her, the way his large hands moved the pieces with surprising delicacy, the concentration that furrowed his brow when he was thinking. Living in such close quarters had revealed aspects of Thatcher Cole that the town's distant observations had never captured. He rose before dawn each morning to tend his cattle, moving through the cabin with careful quiet so as not to wake her. When she emerged from the bedroom, she invariably found fresh coffee waiting and some simple breakfast-prepared eggs from his own chickens, bread he baked in a Dutch oven, preserves made from wild berries he gathered himself. The domestic skills that had produced the beautiful quilt extended to every aspect of his daily life. "You're distracted," he observed, not unkindly. "Something troubling you?" Eliza moved her bishop, then sat back in her chair. "I received a visit from Mrs. Ashford today, from the school board." Thatcher's hand stilled over his next move. "And?" "She wanted to discuss my living situation and its potential impact on my ability to serve as a moral example to the children." Eliza's voice carried a bitter edge. "Apparently, several parents have expressed concern about allowing their children to be taught by someone of questionable virtue." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to go, that you've been nothing but respectful and honorable, and that my personal circumstances have no bearing on my ability to teach arithmetic and reading." Thatcher moved his knight, a strategic placement that threatened her queen. "How did she respond?" She said the board would be meeting next week to discuss the matter. She didn't say so directly, but I think they're planning to dismiss me. Eliza stared at the chessboard without seeing it. 3 years of dedicated service, and it all comes down to spending a few nights under the same roof as a bachelor. I'm sorry. The simple words carried a weight of genuine regret. If I'd thought it through better, maybe I could have found another solution that wouldn't have put your position at risk. Eliza looked up at him sharply. Are you suggesting you should have left me to sleep in the street to preserve the town's sense of propriety? No, but maybe. Thatcher Cole, if you're about to suggest that helping someone in distress was a mistake, I'll be very disappointed in you. Something in her tone seemed to surprise him. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. You're not angry about the situation. You're angry about their response to it. Of course, I'm angry about their response. These are people who claim to follow Christian principles, who preach charity and compassion from their church pews. But the moment someone acts on those principles in a way that challenges their narrow definition of respectability, they turn into a pack of gossiping hypocrites. The vehemence of her words startled them both. Eliza had always been careful to maintain a composed, diplomatic demeanor in her interactions with the townspeople, understanding that her position required a certain level of political delicacy. But living in Thatcher's cabin, experiencing his quiet kindness and genuine consideration, had highlighted the contrast between authentic goodness and performative virtue. I've watched you these past few days, she continued, her voice softer now but no less intense. The way you care for your animals, the attention you put into every task, the respect you show for the food you prepare and the home you've built. There's more real decency in your little finger than in the entire school board combined. Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between her face and the chess pieces. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder. Most people see what they expect to see when they look at me, a big, rough cowboy who's good for ranch work and not much else. Then most people are idiots. The blunt assessment drew a surprised laugh from him, and Eliza felt a flutter of pleasure at the sound. In the 3 days she had been staying with him, she had learned that Thatcher's smiles were rare and precious things, and his laughter rarer still. You know, he said, moving his rook to counter her earlier bishop placement, when I built this cabin, I used to imagine conversations like this. Someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who could see past the surface of things. What else did you imagine? The question slipped out before Eliza could stop it, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. But Thatcher didn't seem embarrassed by the personal turn of the conversation. Meals shared instead of eaten alone. Someone to read to in the winter evenings. Maybe music. I always hoped to find someone who could play piano, but there's no room for one in here. He gestured toward the compact interior of the cabin. Simple things, mostly. The kind of companionship that makes a house feel like a home. Do you play any instruments yourself? Harmonica a little. Nothing fancy. He seemed almost shy about the admission. What about you? I noticed you humming yesterday while you were mending that tear in your skirt. I used to play piano before I came west. And I sing, though not as well as I'd like. She moved her queen to safety, thinking about the musical evenings she used to enjoy back in Pennsylvania before the war changed everything. I miss it sometimes, having music in my daily life. There's a piano at the church, old and out of tune, but it still makes music. Mrs. Ashford made it clear that my welcome at church functions might be somewhat diminished given my current circumstances. Thatcher's expression darkened. Adelaide Ashford is a sanctimonious old hen who wouldn't recognize Christian charity if it knocked on her door asking for shelter from a storm. The harsh assessment surprised Elizash had never heard Thatcher speak critically of anyone in town. You don't like her much. I don't like hypocrites, and she's one of the worst kind. All pious words and judgment, but when old Henrik Peterson was dying last winter and needed help with his cattle, where was her Christian duty then? I spent 3 weeks keeping that man's herd alive, while she organized prayer circles that did nothing but make the participants feel good about themselves. You never mentioned helping Mr. Peterson. Why would I? A man does what needs doing. He doesn't go around town looking for praise. The simple statement revealed more about Thatcher's character than a dozen testimonials could have. Eliza found herself studying his face in the lamplight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he concentrated. When had she begun to find his features not just pleasant, but genuinely handsome? "Check," she said softly, moving her queen into position. Thatcher studied the board, then looked up at her with something that might have been admiration. "You've been planning that for 6 moves. 7, actually. Remind me never to underestimate you, Miss Hart. I thought we had agreed on first names." "Eliza, then." The way he said her name, with careful attention to each syllable, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Though I have to ask, where did a schoolteacher learn to play chess like a military strategist? "My father taught me. He said it was important for a woman to be able to think several moves ahead, whether on a chessboard or in life." She paused, then added quietly, "He also said that the most important thing was knowing when to sacrifice a piece to protect something more valuable." Wise man, he was. Eliza moved a pawn, setting up her final attack. "He died when I was 22. The fever that took him also took my mother 6 months later. That's when I decided to come west and teach." "You were alone." "Completely. Samuel was already deployed, and there wasn't much left for me in Pennsylvania anyway. The West seemed like a place where a person could start over, build something new." Thatcher nodded, understanding implicit in the gesture. "That's why I came here too. After my family died, I couldn't stand being around all those familiar places that reminded me of what I'd lost." "Do you ever regret it, leaving everything you knew?" "Sometimes, but then I think about this place, what I've built here, and I realize that maybe the point isn't to escape the past, but to create something worthy of honoring it." Eliza looked around the cabinet, the carefully crafted furniture, the well-tended books, the small domestic touches that spoke of a man who had learned to create beauty, even in solitude. "You've done that. This is a home worth honoring anyone's memory. It's better with you in it." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that neither was quite ready to acknowledge fully. Eliza felt her pulse quicken, awareness of him as a manot, just a kind neighbor, suddenly acute and undeniable. "Thatcher." "Checkmate," he said quietly, moving his king into a position that ended the game. Eliza stared at the board, realizing that while she had been focused on her planned attack, he had been orchestrating an entirely different strategy. "How did you... I had you cornered." "You were thinking like someone trying to win quickly. I was thinking like someone who wanted the game to last as long as possible." Their eyes met across the small table, and Eliza felt something shift in the space between them. What had begun as emergency shelter was becoming something else, something that had nothing to do with collapsed roofs and everything to do with the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the way her heart jumped when his hand accidentally brushed hers while passing a plate at dinner. "Another game?" she asked, though they both knew she wasn't really talking about chess. "As many as you like," Thatcher replied, his voice softer than usual. "We have all the time in the world." But even as he began resetting the pieces, they both knew that time was exactly what they didn't have. The school board meeting loomed, and with it the possibility that Eliza's position and her reason for staying in Willow Gap might disappear entirely. The thought of leaving this cabin, this man who had shown her what quiet companionship could feel like, filled her with a longing she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was brave enough to examine too closely. The school bell's cracked bronze surface caught the afternoon sunlight as Eliza ran her fingers along its weathered rim. Despite the damage, a long fissure that ran from crown to shoulder it still rang true when struck, its clear tone carrying across the schoolyard with unwavering purpose. Much like herself, she thought with a rueful smile. Cracked but still functional, scarred but still singing. She had arrived early this Monday morning to prepare for what might be her final week of teaching, depending on the school board's decision. The weekend had passed in a strange suspension of time at Thatcher's cabin, both of them careful not to acknowledge the growing tension between practical arrangements and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. "Miss Hart." The voice from the schoolhouse doorway made her turn. A man stood silhouetted against the morning light, tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of expensive clothes that immediately marked him as someone from outside Willow Gap's modest social circles. As he stepped into the sunlight, she could see he was perhaps 45, with silver-touched hair and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of significant wealth and power. "I'm Jeremiah Blackwood," he said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you." Eliza had heard the name, though she had never met the man himself. Jeremiah Blackwood owned considerable property throughout the Territory Ranch land, mining claims and timber rights that made him one of the most influential men in the region. What he might want with a small-town schoolteacher was beyond her imagination. "Mr. Blackwood, how can I help you?" His smile was polished, calculating. "Actually, I believe I might be able to help you. I've heard about your recent difficulties regarding your living situation, and I wanted to discuss a proposition that might resolve several problems at once." Eliza felt a chill of apprehension. "What sort of proposition?" "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private. What I have to discuss is somewhat delicate." Against her better judgment, Eliza gestured toward the schoolhouse. "We can talk inside, but I have students arriving soon." Blackwood followed her into the classroom, his eyes taking in the simple wooden desks, the slate boards, the carefully tended books that made up the school's modest library. His expression suggested mild distaste, as if the humble surroundings offended his sensibilities. "Miss Hart, I'll speak plainly. I'm aware that the school board is concerned about your current living arrangements with Mr. Cole. Such concerns, while perhaps narrow-minded, could result in your dismissal from this position. And I find myself in need of a wife." The blunt statement hit Eliza like a physical blow. She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "A wife," Blackwood repeated calmly. "I'm expanding my business interests into areas that require a certain level of social respectability. A wife would provide that respectability, particularly one with your education and moral standing in the community. My moral standing is currently in question, as you just pointed out. Only because of your association with Cole, marriage to me would instantly restore your reputation and elevate your social position considerably. You would never want for anything fine clothes, a beautiful home, the kind of life a woman of your refinement deserves." Eliza felt as if the world had tilted slightly off its axis. "Mr. Blackwood, I barely know you. What you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting a practical arrangement that would benefit us both. You need security and respectability. I need a wife who can help me navigate the social requirements of expanding business. It's not romantic, perhaps, but it's sensible. And if I refuse—" Something shifted in Blackwood's expression, a hardness that had been hidden beneath the polished exterior. "I would hate to see a talented teacher lose her position over something as trivial as where she chooses to sleep. But these small towns can be so unforgiving about matters of propriety." The threat was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Eliza felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clean. "Are you suggesting that you have influence over the school board's decision?" "I'm suggesting that I have influence over many things in this territory, Miss Hart. The school board values my opinion, as do the owners of the boarding houses, the bank that holds mortgages on most of the businesses in town, and the territorial officials who determine funding for schools like this one." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Blackwood wasn't just making a marriage proposal, he was demonstrating the extent of his power over her life and the lives of everyone in Willow Gap. Cross him, and she would find herself not just unemployed but unemployable, with no resources and no refuge. "You need time to consider, of course," Blackwood continued smoothly. "Shall we say 1 week? That should give you ample opportunity to weigh your options. And if I choose to marry you, what exactly would you expect from this arrangement?" "The usual wifely duties, naturally, hostessing my social events, maintaining my household, providing the appearance of domestic contentment. Children, eventually, to secure my legacy." He paused, his gaze moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. I think you'll find me a reasonable husband, Miss Hart. I don't require affection, merely compliance." The word compliance hung in the air like a poison cloud. Eliza thought of Thatcher's gentle consideration, his careful respect for her autonomy and dignity, and the contrast with this man's cold calculation made her stomach turn. "I'll need time to consider," she said, though every fiber of her being was screaming rejection. "Of course, 1 week, as I said. I'll expect your answer then." After Blackwood left, Eliza sank into her chair behind the teacher's desk and tried to process what had just occurred. The man had essentially bought and paid for her life, presenting marriage as the only alternative to complete ruin. And the most terrifying part was that he probably had the power to make good on his threats. The sound of children's voices in the schoolyard roused her from her dark thoughts. She had a job to do, possibly for only a few more days, and she refused to let Blackwood's manipulations rob her students of her full attention. The day passed in a blur of lessons and recitations, but Eliza found herself watching her students with new intensity, memorizing their faces and voices against the possibility that she might soon be forced to leave them behind. When the final child had departed for home, she remained at her desk, staring at the cracked bell through the window and wondering how everything had become so complicated. She was still there when Thatcher appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and concern written across his features. "Eliza, you're usually home by now. Everything all right?" The word home sent a pang through her chest. When had she begun thinking of his cabin as home? When had the sight of him become the best part of her day? "I had an interesting visitor this morning," she said, then told him about Blackwood's proposition and barely concealed threats. Thatcher's expression grew darker with each detail. By the time she finished, his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "That son of a—" he caught himself, glancing around the schoolroom as if remembering where they were. "He can't force you to marry him, Eliza. There are laws." "Are there? What law prevents a man from refusing to rent rooms to someone he considers morally questionable? What law requires the school board to ignore the concerns of influential community members?" "He's not forcing me, Thatcher. He's simply arranging circumstances so that marriage to him becomes the only viable option. There has to be another way." "Such as?" Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the schoolroom, taking in the carefully organized supplies, the children's work displayed on the walls, the evidence of her dedication to this place and these students. "Marry me instead." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to disturb the very air between them. "What?" "Marry me." His voice was steadier now, more certain. "If you're married, Blackwood can't threaten you with scandal. Your position would be secure, and you'd have the protection of my name and my home." Eliza stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Thatcher, you can't be serious. We've known each other for barely a week. I've known you long enough to know you're kind and brave and that you care more about those children than your own welfare. I've known you long enough to know that living in the same house with you has been the happiest I've been since my family died." He took a step closer, his green eyes intent on her face. "And I've known you long enough to know that the thought of you married to Jeremiah Blackwood makes me want to tear something apart with my bare hands." The raw honesty in his voice left her breathless. "But marriage, it's not just about practical arrangements. There should be love, affection." "There could be. Maybe there already is, beginning." The suggestion hung between them, dangerous and full of possibility. Eliza thought of the evenings they had spent talking by the fire, the way her pulse quickened when he smiled, the growing certainty that she had never felt as safe and valued as she did in his presence. "Eliza," he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "I won't pretend this is how I imagined proposing to someone. But I also won't pretend that the idea of building a life with you doesn't appeal to me more than anything I've wanted in years. And if it doesn't work, if we find we're not suited for marriage, then we'll figure it out together. But at least you'll have choices, real choices, instead of being backed into a corner by a man like Blackwood." The cracked school bell caught the late afternoon light again, its bronze surface gleaming despite its flaws. Still functional, still singing true, still serving its purpose, even though it had been damaged. Maybe, Eliza thought, that was enough of a foundation on which to build something lasting. The pressed wildflower lay between the pages of Whitman's poetry like a secret waiting to be discovered. Eliza had found it quite by accident while borrowing the book from Thatcher's shelf, a delicate prairie rose, perfectly preserved, its pink petals still holding a ghost of their original color. She held it up to the lamplight, wondering when he had placed it there and why. "Find something interesting?" Thatcher's voice from the doorway made her start. She had been so absorbed in her discovery that she hadn't heard him return from his evening chores. Heat crept up her neck as she realized how the scene must look her sitting in his chair, reading his books, examining what was clearly a private memento. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, moving to replace the flower. "I shouldn't have." "It's all right." He crossed to where she sat, his expression unreadable. "I put it there last spring. Found it growing wild near the creek and thought it was too beautiful to just leave it to wither." "It's lovely." She looked up at him, trying to read the emotion in his green eyes. "Were you saving it for someone special?" "I thought I was saving it for no one in particular. Now I'm not so sure." The admission sent warmth spreading through her chest. In the 3 days since his unexpected marriage proposal in the schoolroom, they had been dancing around each other with careful politeness, both uncertain how to navigate the shift from practical cohabitation to something that might become genuine courtship. Eliza had asked for time to consider his offer, and he had given it without pressure, continuing to sleep in the barn and maintain the respectful distance that had characterized their arrangement from the beginning. But the awareness between them had changed, charged now with possibility and the unspoken acknowledgement that they were both considering a future neither had anticipated. "Thatcher," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said gently, "or tomorrow, or even next week if you need more time. Whatever Blackwood's deadline, we'll figure out another way to handle him if marriage isn't what you want." "That's just it. I don't know what I want anymore." She closed the book carefully, keeping the flower safe between its pages. "A month ago, my life was predictable. Lonely, perhaps, but predictable. I taught school, I went home to my boarding room, I read my books and wrote my letters and told myself that contentment was enough. And now I wake up in your bed surrounded by quilts you made with your own hands, and I drink coffee you prepared because you thought I might want it when I emerged from sleep. I sit across from you at meals and listen to you talk about books and ideas and dreams for the future, and I think this is what companionship is supposed to feel like." Thatcher settled into the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds like a good thing." "It is a good thing. That's what frightens me." She met his gaze directly. "I've grown comfortable here, Thatcher. Comfortable in ways that have nothing to do with physical shelter and everything to do with feeling less alone in the world. What if I say yes to marriage and it changes everything? What if we lose this easy companionship in favor of legal obligations and societal expectations? What if we don't?" The simple question hung in the air between them. Eliza found herself studying his face, the strong jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the steady patience in his eyes that had never once pressured her for more than she was ready to give. "Tell me about her," she said suddenly, "the woman whose letters you keep in that wooden box." Thatcher was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Her name was Catherine. We grew up on neighboring farms back in Missouri, knew each other from childhood. Everyone always assumed we'd marry eventually, and I suppose we did too. She was sweet, gentle, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife. But when I talked to her about coming west, about building something new, she wanted no part of it. She wanted to stay close to family, to live the same life her mother had lived and her grandmother before that. There was nothing wrong with that, it just wasn't what I needed." "So you left her behind?" "She was the one who ended our engagement, said she couldn't marry a man whose dreams would take him away from everything she held dear." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "She died of fever 6 months later, before I'd even reached Colorado territory. The letters came from her sister, along with the ones Catherine had written but never sent. What did they say? That she regretted letting fear make her decisions, that she wished she had been brave enough to build a new life with me, instead of clinging to the familiar one." Thatcher's gaze met hers. "I keep them as a reminder that sometimes the safe choice isn't the right choice." The weight of his words settled over them both. Eliza thought about her own safe choices, staying in the boarding room that felt like a tomb, teaching children while denying herself the possibility of having her own, building walls around her heart to protect against the kind of loss she had experienced when Samuel died. "I've been afraid," she admitted, "not just of Blackwood's threats, but of this, of caring about someone again, of letting myself hope for more than just existence. Fear makes sense. Anyone who's lost someone they loved knows how much it can hurt to open your heart again. But you're willing to risk it?" Thatcher leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest. "Eliza, I've been half alive for 7 years, going through the motions of living without really living. These past days with you here talking to you, sharing meals, just knowing there's someone else in these rooms who cares whether I come home safe at the end of the day, it's reminded me what it feels like to be fully alive. And if it doesn't work, if we discover we're not as compatible as we think, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I'd rather risk failure at something real than succeed at something empty." The pressed flower caught her attention again, visible through the book's closed pages, like a promise of beauty preserved against time's passage. How long had Thatcher been hoping for someone to share such small treasures with? How long had he been saving pieces of beauty in the faith that someday there would be someone who would understand their significance? "I have a confession," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's that?" "I've been thinking about what it would be like to stay here permanently, not just until I find other lodging, but really stay. To wake up every morning knowing I'm home, to share meals and conversations and—" She stopped, heat rising in her cheeks. "And everything else that marriage entails." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and charged with the kind of tension that had been building since their first evening by the fire. Thatcher's green eyes darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "Eliza, I need you to know that if you marry me, it won't be just for convenience or protection. I won't be able to pretend it's merely a practical arrangement." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've been fighting feelings for you since the second night you were here, when you hummed while you mended your skirt, and I realized that the sound of your voice had become the thing I most looked forward to each day." He stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so their faces were level. "I'm saying that if you become my wife, I'll want all of it, your thoughts, your dreams, your body in my bed. Children if God blesses us with them. Not eventually, not after we've had time to grow comfortable with the idea, but from the very beginning." Eliza's breath caught at the intensity in his voice, at the raw honesty of his admission. "Thatcher, I know it's not how courtship is supposed to work. I know we should have months of proper calling and chaperoned visits and gradual development of affection. But we don't have months, and maybe we don't need them. Maybe some things are just right from the beginning, even if they're not conventional." She looked into his eyes and saw her own longing reflected there, the hunger for connection, for intimacy, for the kind of love that made a person feel complete rather than merely functional. The careful distance they had maintained was crumbling, and she found she didn't want to preserve it. "What if I said yes?" she whispered. "What if I said yes to all of it? Then I'd make you a promise." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with infinite gentleness. "I'd promise to cherish you, protect you, and love you for as long as there's breath in my body. I'd promise to build a life with you that honors both our dreams and creates new ones we haven't even imagined yet." "And I'd promise the same," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "To love you, to build something beautiful with you, to be brave enough to hope again." When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of someone who had waited years for this moment and wanted to savor every second of it. His lips were warm and firm against hers, and she could taste the sweet promise of a future neither of them had dared to expect. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thatcher rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes, then?" "That's a yes," she whispered, and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that the world beyond the cabin still held threats and challenges that would test their newfound commitment. But inside, warmed by lamplight and the glow of acknowledged love, two hearts that had been empty for too long finally began to feel full again. The legal document lay spread across Thatcher's kitchen table like a death sentence written in elegant script. Jeremiah Blackwood had arrived at the cabin just after dawn, his timing calculated to catch them at their most vulnerable, Eliza in her nightgown and wrapper. Thatcher barely dressed after rushing in from the barn when he heard the commotion. "I thought you should see this before making any rash decisions," Blackwood said smoothly, his cold eyes taking in their obvious domestic intimacy with satisfaction. "It seems your little romance has become even more complicated than either of you realized." Eliza pulled her wrapper tighter around herself and leaned over the document, her teacher's training helping her pass the legal language despite her racing heart. What she read made her blood turn to ice. "This says you own the land under the schoolhouse," she whispered. "Indeed. Purchased it from the territorial government 3 months ago, along with several other strategically located parcels throughout the county." Blackwood's smile was predatory. "You see, Miss Hart, your position was never really dependent on the school board's goodwill. It was dependent on mine." Thatcher moved to stand behind Eliza, his hands settling protectively on her shoulders as he read over the document. "What's your point, Blackwood?" "My point, Mr. Cole, is that romantic gestures are all well and good, but they don't change practical realities. Miss Hart can marry whomever she chooses, but if she doesn't marry me, there simply won't be a school for her to teach in." "You can't shut down the school," Eliza said, though even as she spoke the words, she could see the truth in his triumphant expression. The children can be educated elsewhere. There's a perfectly adequate school in Millfield, only 20 miles away. The parents can make arrangements. 20 miles might as well be 200 for most of these families. They can't afford to board their children elsewhere, and the younger ones couldn't make that journey daily. Not my concern. Blackwood retrieved the document and folded it carefully. "I have business interests that require the land this school occupies. If the building happens to be in the way of progress, well, that's unfortunate but unavoidable." Thatcher's hands tightened on Eliza's shoulders. "What kind of business interests?" "Railroad expansion, if you must know. The territorial government is very interested in extending the line through this region, and I've positioned myself to facilitate that expansion. The school sits directly in the path of the proposed route." "So this was never about wanting a wife at all," Eliza said, pieces of his strategy becoming clear. "This was about removing obstacles to your railroad deal." "Oh, I do want a wife, Miss Hart. A woman of your refinement would be a considerable asset in my social and business circles. But you're correct that my primary concern is eliminating anything that might complicate my negotiations with the railroad company." "And if she refuses to marry you?" Blackwood shrugged with feigned indifference. "Then the school closes, the children are dispersed to other districts, and Miss Hart finds herself unemployed in a territory where I have considerable influence over who gets hired for teaching positions. She's welcome to try her luck elsewhere, of course, but I suspect she'll find opportunities somewhat limited." The casual cruelty of his plan took Eliza's breath away. He had maneuvered her into a position where refusing him would harm not just herself, but every child in Willow Gap and their families. It was manipulation of the most sophisticated, using her own compassion and sense of duty as weapons against her. "There's more," Blackwood continued, pulling out a second set of papers. "I've also been acquiring debts and mortgages throughout the region. It's amazing how many people are struggling to make their payments, particularly ranchers trying to expand their operations with borrowed money." Thatcher went very still behind her. "What are you talking about?" "Your mortgage, Mr. Cole. The one you took out 2 years ago to buy additional grazing land and improve your herd. The bank was happy to sell me the note at a discount. Apparently, they were concerned about your ability to make the final payments. Eliza felt Thatcher's hands tremble slightly on her shoulders, and her heart broke for him. He had been so proud of his ranch, of building something substantial and lasting with his own hands. The idea that he might lose it was devastating enough, but to have that threat used as leverage in Blackwood's twisted courtship made it infinitely worse. "The payments aren't due for another 18 months, Thatcher said, his voice carefully controlled. "Under the original terms, yes, but loan agreements often include provisions for immediate payment if the noteholder deems the borrower's circumstances to have changed in ways that affect their ability to repay." Blackwood's smile was cold. Living arrangements that compromise a man's moral standing might constitute such a change. "You bastard." "Language, Mr. Cole. There's a lady present." Blackwood's tone remained conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of their lives. "Of course, if Miss Hart were to marry me instead of you, I might be persuaded to extend more favorable terms on your loan. Possibly even forgive it entirely as a wedding gift to my bride's former landlord." The word landlord was delivered with just enough emphasis to make it clear that Blackwood knew exactly what their relationship had become, and that he intended to use even their growing love as ammunition against them. Eliza turned in Thatcher's arms to face him, seeing her own anguish reflected in his green eyes. "He's been planning this for months, hasn't he? Positioning himself to control every aspect of our lives." "It would appear so. The question now," Blackwood interjected, "is what you intend to do about it. Miss Hart, you have until the end of the week to give me your answer. Choose me, and the school remains open. The children continue their education, and Mr. Cole keeps his ranch. Choose him, and everyone suffers the consequences of your selfishness." After Blackwood left, they stood in the kitchen holding each other, while the magnitude of their situation sank in. Everything they had begun to build together, the tentative love, the hope for a shared future, had been poisoned by one man's greed and lust for control. "There has to be another way," Thatcher said finally. "Some legal recourse, some way to fight this." "With what?" "He owns the judge's mortgage too, probably, and half the territorial officials. Men like Blackwood don't make moves like this unless they're certain they can't be stopped." "So, what do we do?" Eliza pulled back to look at him, memorizing his face as if she were already saying goodbye. "We do what we have to do to protect the people we care about." "Eliza, no. You can't be thinking of, what choice do we have? If I marry you, 60 children lose their education, and you lose everything you've worked for. If I marry him, at least the damage is limited to just me." "Just you?" Thatcher's voice was raw with emotion. "Eliza, you're not just anyone to me. You're everything. The thought of you married to that man, subjected to his—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know, but sometimes love means making sacrifices to protect the people you love." "No." His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "There has to be another way. I won't let him have you, not like this." "What if there isn't another way? What if this is the choice we have to make?" Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the cabin that had become their refuge, their sanctuary from the world's harshness. When he spoke again, his voice was steady with resolve. "Then we fight. We find a way to expose him, to break his hold over this town. And if we can't—" He paused, then continued with fierce determination. "If we can't, then we leave. All of us. We take the children and their families, and we start over somewhere. He can't reach us. That's impossible. These people have roots here, lives, property. Property he's trying to steal anyway, lives he's trying to control. Maybe it's time for all of us to be brave enough to choose freedom over security." The idea was audacious, probably impossible, certainly dangerous. But as Eliza looked into Thatcher's eyes and saw the unwavering determination there, she felt something she hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Hope. Maybe they couldn't fight Jeremiah Blackwood on his terms, with his weapons and his rules. But maybe they could fight him on their own terms, with courage and community and the kind of love that refused to be bought or sold or compromised. It would have to be everyone, she said slowly. Every family with children in the school. They'd all have to be willing to leave everything behind. Then we convince them. We show them what staying will cost and what leaving might gain. We give them a choice that Blackwood never intended them to have. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again on the horizon, dark and threatening. But inside the cabin, two people who had found love in the midst of loneliness were discovering that together they might be strong enough to weather whatever storm was coming. Thatcher's father's rifle lay across his knees like a bridge between past and present, its polished walnut stock worn smooth by generations of hands that had wielded it in defense of family and principle. He sat on the cabin's front porch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the eastern horizon for the first hint of light that would signal the beginning of what might be the most important day of his life. 3 days had passed since Blackwood's ultimatum, and they had been the most intense 72 hours Eliza could remember. What had begun as desperate planning had evolved into something she could only describe as a quiet revolution. Families throughout Willow Gap, coming together in ways that transcended individual self-interest and reached toward something larger and more hopeful. It had started with the Brennans. Eliza had visited their farm the evening after Blackwood's threatening visit, carrying with her a proposal that sounded insane, even to her own ears. What if they all left? What if every family affected by the school closure simply pulled up stakes and moved somewhere Blackwood's influence couldn't reach them? Mary Brennan had listened in silence while her husband Tom paced the small kitchen, his weathered face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been desperate hope. "You're talking about abandoning everything we've built here," Tom had said finally. "This farm, our neighbors, the life we've made." "I'm talking about saving what matters most," Eliza had replied. "Your children's future, their education, the community bonds that make a place worth living in. And where exactly would we go? How would we support ourselves? These are practical questions, Miss Hart, not romantic dreams." But Mary had been thinking, her sharp mind already working through possibilities. "There's that land in Oregon Territory my brother wrote about. Good soil, timber rights included, and far enough from here that Blackwood's reach wouldn't extend. Oregon's 1,000 miles away, Mary. So is freedom, apparently." The conversation had lasted until well past midnight, with neighbors drifting in as word spread, drawn by the unprecedented nature of what was being discussed. By dawn, 17 families had committed to the plan, with more expressing cautious interest. The pattern had repeated itself throughout the following days. Eliza and Thatcher had become circuit riders of hope, traveling from farm to farm and house to house, carrying word of the growing exodus and the dream of building something better elsewhere. Not everyone was convinced. The Ashfords had refused even to hear them out, Mrs. Ashford declaring the entire plan the foolish fantasy of people who refuse to accept practical realities. Several other prominent families had expressed similar skepticism, preferring the devil they knew to the uncertainty of starting over in unknown territory. But the momentum was building, driven by a combination of desperation and something more powerful, the recognition that they were not powerless victims of Blackwood's manipulation, but people capable of choosing their own destiny. The plan they had developed was audacious in its scope. Tom Brennan, who had served as a wagon master before settling in Willow Gap, would lead the caravan. They would travel in stages, selling what they could and carrying what they must, pooling resources to ensure no family was left behind due to financial constraints. Mary Brennan and 2 other women had been corresponding frantically with contacts in Oregon, securing promises of land and employment for the group. Most importantly, they had found a way to take the school with them. Not the building, obviously, but the institution itself. Eliza would continue as their teacher, and they would establish a new school in whatever community they created. The children's education would not just continue, it would be enhanced by the adventure and challenge of building something from nothing. But first, they had to survive Blackwood's reaction to their defiance. "Any regrets?" Eliza asked softly, settling beside Thatcher on the porch steps. She carried 2 cups of coffee, steam rising like incense in the cool morning air. "About what?" "All of this. A week ago you were a quiet rancher who minded his own business. Now you're leading what amounts to a rebellion against the most powerful man in the territory." Thatcher accepted the coffee gratefully, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "I've been thinking about that, about how quickly everything changed. And I realized that nothing really changed at all. The corruption was always there, the abuse of power, the way men like Blackwood use other people as game pieces in their personal chess matches. We just decided to stop pretending we didn't see it." A rider appeared on the distant road, spurring his horse hard toward town. Even at this distance, they could see the urgency in his posture, the way he leaned forward in the saddle, as if trying to will more speed from his mount. "That's Billy Morrison," Thatcher observed. "Tom Brennan's nephew. He was supposed to be scouting the route west of here, looking for the best river crossings." They watched as the rider disappeared into town, and Eliza felt a chill of premonition. Something's wrong. Within an hour, their fears were confirmed. Billy Morrison arrived at the cabin with news that changed everything. Blackwood had somehow learned of their plans and was moving to stop them with a brutality that exceeded even their worst expectations. "He's got men at every road leading out of the county," Billy reported, his young face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Armed men, claiming legal authority to prevent what he's calling theft of property and breach of contract. Anyone trying to leave with wagons or livestock is being turned back." "On what grounds?" Thatcher demanded. "Debt collection, mostly. Turns out he owns paper on damn near every family that signed up for this exodus. Notes he bought up in the past few months, all of them suddenly coming due immediately." Eliza felt the dream crumbling around them, like sand through her fingers. "How many families are trapped?" "All of them. And there's more. He's got territorial marshals coming in from the capital, claiming there's been organized resistance to legal debt collection. Anyone who doesn't pay up immediately is looking at arrest for fraud and conspiracy." The scope of Blackwood's counterstrike was breathtaking in its thoroughness. He had anticipated their plan and prepared responses that trapped them more completely than any cage could have. Worse, he had given their act of collective courage the appearance of criminal conspiracy, justifying whatever harsh measures he chose to employ. "There's got to be something we can do," Eliza said. But even as she spoke, she could hear the defeat in her own voice. "There is," Thatcher said quietly. "We can give him what he wants." Both Billy and Eliza stared at him in shock. "You can't mean," Eliza began. "I mean, we can make him think he's won while we prepare for the real fight." Thatcher's voice carried a note of grim determination that she had never heard before. "Billy, ride back to town. Tell everyone to act defeated, to start making arrangements to settle their debts however they can. Make it look like they're giving up." "But if they pay him, they'll have nothing left to start over with," Billy protested. "They're not going to pay him. They're going to make him think they're preparing to pay him while we put together a different kind of plan." "What kind of plan?" Thatcher stood and walked to the cabin's door, retrieving his father's rifle from where it leaned against the frame. The weapon seemed to transform him, connecting him to something deeper and more dangerous than the gentle rancher they had come to know. The kind that acknowledges what Blackwood really is: not a businessman or a legal authority, but a criminal who's been allowed to operate with impunity because no one has been willing to stop him. "Thatcher, you're talking about violence." "I'm talking about justice. There's a difference, though sometimes the methods overlap." Eliza felt fear and admiration warring in her chest. This was a side of Thatcher she had never seen, harder, more ruthless, shaped by experiences he had never shared with her. But beneath the surface change, she could still see the man who had wrapped her in his quilt and offered her shelter from the storm. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to trust me. And I need you to be ready to leave at a moment's notice, with or without the others." I won't abandon those families. You won't have to. But if this goes wrong, if Blackwood proves to be more dangerous than we anticipated, I want you safe. And I want you alive. Whatever you're planning, promise me you won't take unnecessary risks." Thatcher's smile was soft, despite the hardness in his eyes. "I promise to come back to you, Eliza. Whatever it takes, I'll come back." As Billy rode away to carry word of their new strategy, Eliza watched Thatcher prepare for whatever confrontation was coming. He moved with the methodical precision of a man who had faced danger before and survived, checking his weapons, organizing his supplies, making the kind of careful preparations that suggested this was not his first time planning for violent conflict. "You were a soldier," she said suddenly, the pieces of his past clicking into place. "For a while, after my family died and before I came west. You never mentioned it. It wasn't something I wanted to carry forward into this life, but sometimes the past doesn't give you a choice about what parts of yourself you have to use." The sun was fully up now, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to mock the darkness of their situation. Somewhere in town, Blackwood was probably celebrating his victory, confident that he had crushed their rebellion before it could truly begin. He was about to learn that some things, love, community, the desperate courage of people defending their children's future, were harder to crush than he had anticipated. "When do we make our move?" Eliza asked. "Tonight, when the marshals are settled in for the evening and Blackwood thinks he's won." Thatcher's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "By tomorrow morning, either we'll be free or we'll be dead, but we won't be slaves to his greed anymore." The simple finality of his words sent both terror and exhilaration through her. In 12 hours, their carefully constructed new life would either be secured forever or destroyed completely. There would be no middle ground, no compromise, no gradual resolution. Just two people who had found love in the midst of loneliness, preparing to risk everything to protect that love and the community that had embraced it. The town meeting bell rang out across Willow Gap at sunset, its bronze voice carrying a summons that had never been more urgent. One by one, figures emerged from houses and farms, moving through the gathering dusk toward the schoolhouse where Eliza had spent so many hopeful days teaching children who might soon be scattered to the winds. The building was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. Faces that Eliza had known for 3 years looked drawn and worried in the lamplight, parents who had trusted her with their children's futures, neighbors who had become friends, families who had dared to dream of something better only to find themselves trapped by their own courage. At the front of the room, Jeremiah Blackwood stood beside a table laden with legal documents, his expensive suit and confident, bearing a stark contrast to the work clothes and worried expressions of the assembled crowd. 2 territorial marshals flanked him, their badges catching the light like small suns, their hands resting casually on their sidearms. "Thank you all for coming," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I know this has been a difficult time for everyone, with all the uncertainty and wild rumors that have been circulating." A murmur ran through the crowd, the kind of restless sound that came from people biting back words they desperately wanted to speak. "I'm here tonight to clear up any confusion about the legal realities of your situations," Blackwood continued. "As you know, I hold valid debt instruments on most of your property's loans that have come due and must be satisfied immediately." Tom Brennan stood up slowly, his weathered face grim but determined. "Those loans weren't supposed to mature for years yet. You can't just change the terms because it suits your business interests." "Actually, Mr. Brennan, I can. The loan agreements all contain standard provisions, allowing for immediate collection if the borrower's circumstances change in ways that affect their creditworthiness. Living arrangements that compromise moral standing, for instance, or participation in organized efforts to defraud creditors by fleeing the territory." "Nobody was trying to defraud anyone," Mary Brennan called out. "We were trying to save our children's education. By abandoning your legal obligations, by conspiring to remove assets from the reach of legitimate creditors." Blackwood's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. I'm afraid the law sees things differently. One of the marshals stepped forward, pulling out a sheaf of warrants. We have arrest orders for anyone who participated in planning this exodus. The charges include conspiracy to defraud, breach of contract, and organized resistance to lawful debt collection. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza looked around the room at faces that had moved from worry to fear to the kind of desperate resignation that came when people realized they were truly trapped. That was when Thatcher stood up. He had been sitting in the back corner, his father's rifle propped against the wall beside him, his presence so quiet that many people hadn't even noticed he was there. But when he rose to his full height and stepped into the lamplight, every eye in the room turned to him. "Before anyone gets arrested," he said, his voice carrying easily through the packed room, "I think folks should know the truth about Mr. Blackwood's business practices." Blackwood's confident expression flickered slightly. "Mr. Cole, this is hardly the time for—" "It's exactly the time." Thatcher walked forward, his movements deliberate and calm, until he stood facing Blackwood across the table of legal documents. "Tell them about the bribes, Jeremiah. Tell them about the territorial officials you've bought and paid for." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Cole. I hope you have evidence to support it." "I do." Thatcher reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it on the table between them. "Correspondence between you and Territorial Governor Morrison discussing payments for favorable railroad legislation. Financial records showing money transferred to Judge Harrison in exchange for rulings on property disputes. Bank records documenting your purchase of debt instruments at suspiciously low rates." The marshals moved closer, but their expressions had changed from confident authority to uncertain confusion. "Where did you get those documents?" Blackwood demanded, his composure finally cracking. "Your office safe. Amazing what a man can accomplish when he's motivated by love and has experience with locks from his military days." A gasp ran through the crowd. Eliza stared at Thatcher in shock, realizing that his mysterious absence earlier that day hadn't been spent preparing for a violent confrontation at all, but on the kind of careful intelligence gathering that his soldiers' training had taught him. "That's theft," Blackwood sputtered. "Breaking and entering. Marshal Peterson, arrest this man immediately." But Marshal Peterson was examining the documents with growing interest, his expression darkening as he read. "These look genuine, Blackwood. If they are, we've got bigger problems than debt collection." "Of course they're genuine," Thatcher said calmly. "Everything you need to expose Blackwood's corruption network is right there, including evidence that he's been using territorial resources to intimidate legitimate business competitors and manipulate land sales for personal profit." The second marshal, younger than Peterson and clearly out of his depth, looked uncertain. "Sir, if these documents are authentic, shouldn't we be investigating Mr. Blackwood instead of executing these warrants?" "The documents are forgeries," Blackwood declared, but his voice carried a note of desperation that undermined his words. "Manufactured evidence designed to cover up organized criminal conspiracy." "Then you won't mind if we verify their authenticity," Marshal Peterson said, "starting with a telegram to the territorial capital to confirm these financial transactions." "I absolutely forbid." "You forbid?" Peterson's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Mr. Blackwood, if you've been bribing territorial officials and using fraudulent legal instruments to steal people's property, you're the one who's going to be under arrest." The power dynamic in the room shifted so suddenly it was almost visible. Blackwood, who moments before had been the confident orchestrator of their destruction, now looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between the marshals and the crowd of people who were beginning to understand that they might not be the criminals in this situation after all. "There's more," Thatcher continued, pulling out another set of documents. "Blackwood doesn't actually own the land under the schoolhouse. The deed he showed you, Eliza, is a forgery. The real owner is the Territorial Education Department, and they have no intention of selling to railroad interests." Eliza felt her knees go weak with relief and shock. "How did you—" "Military contacts in the territorial capital. Amazing how quickly doors open when you mention corruption involving federal railroad contracts. Blackwood made a sudden move toward the door, but found his way blocked by Tom Brennan and several other men who had positioned themselves strategically around the room. "Going somewhere, Jeremiah?" Tom asked mildly. "This is illegal detention. You can't." "Actually, we can," Marshal Peterson said, producing a different set of handcuffs. "Jeremiah Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, bribery, extortion, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you'll have plenty to say once we start unraveling this whole operation." As the marshals led Blackwood away, the schoolhouse erupted in a chaos of voices, relief, celebration, disbelief, and plans for the future, all mixing together in a symphony of hope restored. Eliza pushed through the crowd to reach Thatcher, throwing her arms around him with tears streaming down her face. "You magnificent, terrifying, wonderful man," she whispered against his chest. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the moment he threatened you," Thatcher replied, his arms tightening around her. "Nobody threatens the woman I love and gets away with it." The future spread out before them like an unmarked map, uncertain in its details but bright with possibility. The school would remain open, the families would keep their homes, and two people who had found love in the midst of loneliness would finally be free to build the life they had dreamed of together. The telegram to the territorial governor crackled through the lines like lightning, carrying with it the evidence that would reshape not just Willow Gap's future, but the entire territorial administration's approach to railroad expansion and land rights. Marshal Peterson had worked through the night, coordinating with federal authorities who had apparently been investigating Blackwood's network for months without sufficient evidence to move forward. Now they had more evidence than they could process. Eliza stood in the schoolhouse the morning after Blackwood's arrest, watching through the windows as a stream of official carriages and riders brought investigators, prosecutors, and territorial officials to what had been, just days before, a quiet frontier town where the biggest excitement was usually the arrival of the monthly mail. "Hard to believe it's over," she murmured to Thatcher, who was helping her restore the classroom to its normal order after the previous night's dramatic meeting. "It's not over," he replied, straightening a row of desks with the same methodical care he brought to all his tasks. "This is just the beginning. Blackwood was just one man in a larger network of corruption. The investigation is going to reach all the way to the territorial capital, maybe even Washington." The schoolhouse door opened, and Marshal Peterson entered, his badge catching the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. His expression was weary but satisfied, the look of a man who had spent years chasing shadows and finally stepped into the light. "Miss Hart, Mr. Cole, I wanted to update you on the situation and get your statements for the official record." "Of course," Eliza said. "How can we help?" "First, I want to confirm that all charges against the families who were planning to leave the territory have been dropped. Blackwood's debt instruments were largely fraudulent, either forged entirely or obtained through bribery and coercion. The Territorial Attorney General has declared them invalid." Relief flooded through Eliza so powerfully that she had to sit down in the nearest student desk. "So the families keep their homes?" "They keep their homes, their property, and their dignity. More than that, they're going to receive compensation for the harassment and illegal collection attempts they've endured." Thatcher set down the slate board he had been cleaning. "What about the school, the land underneath it?" "Completely legitimate territorial property, designated for educational use in perpetuity. Blackwood had no authority to threaten closure, and the Territorial Education Department has confirmed that funding for the school will not only continue, but be increased to support expanded programming." "And Blackwood himself?" Peterson's expression hardened. "He's being transferred to the territorial capital for trial on federal charges. The evidence you gathered, Mr. Cole, has opened up investigations into corruption networks across 3 territories. We're looking at the biggest political scandal in the region's history." Through the window, Eliza could see children beginning to arrive for the school day, their faces bright with the resilience that allowed young people to bounce back from crisis faster than adults. Jimmy Brennan was chasing his sister with a grasshopper, while little Mary Carson carefully carried her primer as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "There's one more thing," Peterson continued. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you both personally. He's arriving this afternoon to formally apologize for the administration's failure to investigate Blackwood's activities sooner." "That's not necessary," Thatcher said. "We were just protecting our own." "Maybe so, but your actions exposed corruption that was costing honest people their livelihoods across the entire territory. The governor considers you heroes." After Peterson left, Eliza and Thatcher stood together in the schoolhouse, surrounded by the evidence of normal life resuming, children's voices from the playground, the distant sound of hammers as repairs were made to storm-damaged buildings, the comforting routine of a community going about its daily business. "Heroes," Eliza repeated softly. "Is that what we are?" "We're people who refuse to let fear make our decisions for us," Thatcher replied. "People who chose to fight for what mattered instead of accepting defeat. People who found each other when we needed it most." That too. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window, where a small cavalry of riders was approaching the school. At their head rode a man in his 50s, distinguished and official-looking, wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as someone of considerable importance. "That would be the governor," Thatcher observed. "Are you ready for this? Being celebrated as territorial heroes?" "I'm ready for whatever comes next, as long as it comes with you." The governor's visit was everything Peterson had promised. Formal apologies, public recognition, and assurances that the territorial administration would implement new safeguards to prevent future corruption. But for Eliza, the most meaningful moment came when Governor Morrison asked to address her students directly. "Children," he said, standing at the front of the classroom where Eliza usually conducted lessons, "your teacher and Miss Cole have shown all of us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. They fought not just for themselves, but for your right to an education and your family's right to live free from fear." Little Mary Carson raised her hand. "Are the bad men going to come back?" "No, sweetheart. The bad men are going to jail, where they belong, and your school is going to be here for as long as you need it." "Good," Jimmy Brennan declared with the fierce certainty of childhood, "because Miss Hart is the best teacher ever, and we don't want anybody else." The simple endorsement brought tears to Eliza's eyes. These children, who had been unwitting pawns in Blackwood's schemes, would grow up knowing that ordinary people could stand against corruption and win. They would carry that knowledge into their own futures, making them stronger and braver than they might otherwise have been. As the official visitors departed and the normal rhythm of the school day resumed, Eliza found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A month ago, she had been a lonely schoolteacher living in a boarding room, convinced that contentment was the best she could hope for. Now she was engaged to a man who had risked everything to protect her, surrounded by a community that had proven itself capable of extraordinary courage and facing a future bright with possibility. "Miss Hart?" Jimmy Brennan's voice interrupted her reverie. "Are you and Mr. Cole really going to get married?" "We are, Jimmy." "Good. My ma says it's about time you both stopped being so lonesome." Out of the mouths of babes, Eliza thought. Sometimes the simplest truths were the most profound ones. When the school day ended and the last child had departed for home, Thatcher appeared in the doorway as he had so many times before. But now there was no uncertainty in his presence, no careful distance maintained for propriety's sake. He crossed the room and took her in his arms as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "More than ready." As they walked together toward the cabin that had become their sanctuary and would soon become their official home, Eliza reflected on the events that had transformed their lives. It had begun with a storm that destroyed her roof and ended with a different kind of storm that had swept away the corruption threatening their entire community. But between those storms, something beautiful had grown, love that had taken root in loneliness and bloomed into something strong enough to change the world, or at least their small corner of it. Tomorrow, there would be a wedding to plan, a future to build, and the ordinary miracle of two hearts that had learned to beat in harmony. Tonight, there was simply the quiet joy of walking home together, no longer alone. 6 months had transformed Willow Gap from a place where people lived in quiet desperation to a community that hummed with purpose and hope. The wedding rings that Thatcher had crafted from silver, mined on his own property, caught the afternoon sunlight as Eliza adjusted the simple bouquet of prairie wildflowers. She carried the same delicate blooms he had once pressed between. The pages of Whitman's poetry, now gathered fresh from the meadow where they had walked together the evening before. The ceremony was to take place in the schoolyard, under the spreading oak tree that had shaded generations of children at play. It seemed fitting, somehow, that their marriage should begin in the place where their love had been tested and proven strong enough to withstand not just personal challenges, but the kind of corruption that could have destroyed their entire community. Eliza stood in the schoolhouse, making final adjustments to her dresser, simple but elegant gown of ivory silk that Mary Brennan had sewn with loving care, using fabric ordered specially from Denver. Through the window, she could see the chairs arranged in neat rows, already filling with guests who had come to celebrate not just a wedding, but a victory that belonged to all of them. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Patterson said softly, adjusting the simple wreath of flowers that served as Eliza's bridal crown. The older woman's eyes were bright with tears of joy and relief. Her boarding house had been fully repaired in the month since the storm, but she had insisted that Eliza was welcome to use it as a dressing room for her wedding day. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Patterson. For taking me in when I first arrived in Willow Gap, for standing by me during the trouble with Blackwood, for being the mother I needed when mine wasn't here to see this day." "Oh, my dear girl," Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "You've brought more joy to this community than you know. The way you've loved our children, the courage you've shown, we're the ones who should be thanking you." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. "Miss Hart? Mrs. Patterson? It's time." Tom Brennan stood in the doorway, dressed in his Sunday best, and wearing the kind of proud smile that fathers usually reserved for their own daughters. When Eliza's father had died, she never imagined that anyone would walk her down the aisle on her wedding day. But Tom had asked for the honor, and she couldn't think of anyone more deserving. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm. "More than ready." They stepped out into the golden afternoon light, and Eliza felt her breath catch at the sight that greeted her. Nearly the entire town had gathered for the ceremony, faces that had become dear to her over 3 years of teaching their children, loving their community, and finally fighting for their shared future. The children sat in the front rows, scrubbed clean and dressed in their finest clothes, their eyes bright with excitement at seeing their beloved teacher become a bride. But it was Thatcher who drew her gaze and held it as she walked down the makeshift aisle between the chairs. He stood beneath the oak tree with Reverend Matthews, wearing a suit that had been tailored to fit his tall frame, his dark hair combed back, and his green eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that she felt tears threatening to spill over. This was the man who had opened his door to her on the night when she had nowhere else to turn. The man who had wrapped her in his handmade quilt and offered her not just shelter, but the possibility of home. The man who had risked everything to protect her and their community from corruption and greed. The man who had taught her that love didn't always announce itself with fanfare and grand gestures. Sometimes it grew quietly in the spaces between ordinary moments, in shared meals and evening conversations, and the simple miracle of no longer being alone. When she reached his side, Tom placed her hand in Thatcher's with gentle ceremony. "Take care of her, son. She's precious to all of us." "I will," Thatcher promised, his voice rough with emotion, "for the rest of my life." Reverend Matthews had known them both since they arrived in Willow Gap, had watched their friendship deepen into love, had stood with the community during the dark days when Blackwood's threats had seemed insurmountable. His words were simple but profound, speaking of marriage as both sanctuary and adventure, as the choice to build something together that neither person could create alone. "Do you, Thatcher Cole, take Eliza Hart to be your wife, to love and cherish, to protect and support, in times of plenty and times of want, in sickness and in health?" For as long as you both shall live. I do. The words carried the weight of absolute certainty. And do you, Eliza Hart, take Thatcher Cole to be your husband, to love and cherish, to support and stand beside, in times of plenty and times of want, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the assembled crowd like a bell. The rings they exchanged were simple bands crafted from the same silver that Thatcher had mined from his own land, polished to a soft glow that would only grow more beautiful with time and wear. As he slipped the band onto her finger, Eliza thought of all the hands that had shaped this moment. Tom Brennan's skilled guidance during the crisis with Blackwood, Mary Brennan's loving needlework on her dress, Mrs. Patterson's maternal care, the children's innocent faith that everything would work out as it should. But most of all, she thought of Thatcher's hands gentle enough to craft quilts and press flowers in books, strong enough to build a home and defend it against those who would destroy it, loving enough to offer sanctuary to a stranger, and patient enough to let that sanctuary become something deeper and more lasting. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thatcher, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was tender and sweet, full of promise for the life they would build together. When they broke apart, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause. But Eliza was aware only of Thatcher's eyes, bright with unshed tears of joy. Mrs. Cole, he whispered, trying out her new name. I like the sound of that, she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The celebration that followed was everything a frontier wedding should be: abundant food prepared by the entire community, music provided by anyone who could play an instrument, and dancing that continued long after the sun had set and the lanterns had been lit. Children ran between the adults like happy sprites, getting underfoot and being indulged because it was a day for joy, not scolding. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift home to their own families, Eliza and Thatcher found themselves alone beneath the oak tree where they had just been married. The schoolhouse stood empty behind them, waiting for Monday morning when she would return to teach the children who had become as dear to her as if they were her own. But everything would be different now. She would no longer go home to loneliness and silence. She would go home to Thatcher, to the cabin they would share as husband and wife, to the family they hoped to create together in the years to come. Any regrets? Thatcher asked, echoing the question she had posed to him on the morning they had faced down Blackwood's final threat. Only that it took a collapsed roof to bring us together, she replied. Though I suppose some of the best things in life happen when we least expect them. I've been thinking about that, about how we almost missed each other entirely. What do you mean? If your roof hadn't collapsed that night, if you hadn't been desperate enough to knock on my door, would we ever have really gotten to know each other? I might have spent the rest of my life admiring you from a distance, thinking you were too refined for someone like me. Eliza considered this, thinking of the careful social barriers that had kept them apart, despite living in the same small town for 3 years. And I might have spent the rest of my life convinced that contentment was enough, that asking for more was somehow greedy or foolish. So we're grateful for the storm. Grateful for the storm, she agreed, and for everything that came after. They walked home together through the quiet streets of Willow Gap, past houses where the lights were beginning to dim as families settled in for the night, past the schoolhouse where she would continue her work as both teacher and citizen of a community that had proven itself capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The cabin, their home now, officially and forever glowed with lamplight and the promise of the life they would build together. As they crossed the threshold as husband and wife, Eliza thought of that desperate night 6 months ago when she had arrived soaked and homeless, carrying nothing but a teaching primer and the remnants of her dignity. Now she carried something far more precious, the certainty that she was loved completely and forever by a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to offer not just shelter, but his whole heart. The bed that had once been empty now held the promise of shared dreams and whispered conversations and the kind of intimacy that transformed a house into a true home. As they prepared for their first night as husband and wife, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from loneliness to love, from despair to hope, from two separate lives to one shared future. Sometimes, she thought, the deepest happiness came not from grand adventures or dramatic gestures, but from the simple miracle of finding someone who made the ordinary moments of life feel extraordinary. Someone who saw your flaws and loved you anyway, who shared your burdens and doubled your joys, who transformed the silence of solitude into the comfortable quiet of companionship. 6 months later, as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza stood at the cabin window, watching Thatcher work in their garden, harvesting the last vegetables before the first frost. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew strong and safe, already loved beyond measure by parents who understood the preciousness of family created by choice as much as by blood. The schoolhouse bell rang out across Willow Gap, calling children to another day of learning and discovery. In a few minutes, she would walk to the schoolhouse as she had done countless times before, but now she walked as a woman who had everything she had ever dared to hope for, and more than she had ever dreamed possible. Behind her, on the mantelpiece, a pressed wildflower rested between the pages of a book of poetry, no longer a symbol of solitary beauty, but a reminder of love that had taken root in the most unlikely circumstances and bloomed into something that would last forever. The bed that had once been empty now held the promise of generations to come, of children who would grow up knowing that love could triumph over fear, that communities could stand together against injustice, and that sometimes the most extraordinary lives began with the simplest acts of kindness, like opening a door to shelter someone from the storm.